Okay, good morning. If everyone could start making their ways to seats, we'll get started here right now. I'll introduce myself in a moment, but first I need to make an announcement about the space's accessibility. The community room is T-Coil enabled. If you have T-Coil enabled devices, please feel welcome to switch them on at this time. If you don't have a T-Coil enabled device, but would like to use one of our headsets, we have made some available on top of the piano. I'll also request that you silence your cell phones for the duration of this program. So, my name is Cliff Robinson, and I'm the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. It's my honor to welcome you today to the library's second Public Humanities Forum, an annual event which brings the specialized expertise of scholars and professionals into conversation with engaged citizens so that the tribunal of public reason may exercise itself upon the challenge of these experts' work. This year's forum brings before us a stellar cast of leading experts in historical research, professional journalism, and political theory to consider not only how far a democratic society's informed public depends upon historical understanding and journalistic integrity, but also how a pluralistic, engaged citizenry is likewise essential to the flourishing of these studies and practices. Today's program was made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, above all, the SPIA and NJ initiative of Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs, which provided generous funding for our lunch today. Thank you, Stacy. I think I saw you just come in. Also, the Princeton University Humanities Council and Program in Journalism, and finally, Labyrinth Books. I'd also like to express the library's gratitude to each of our speakers for their participation in this event. Finally, I must thank the Princeton Public Library's Humanities Council for their advisory role in the shaping of this event. And I'd like to single out Janie Herman, the library's adult programming manager. She's here on camera duty. And Kim Dorman, the community engagement coordinator, for their collaboration at every stage of this event's development. The shape of the event today is as follows. A first panel, Democracy, Citizenship, and the Power of the Powerless, proceeds from historical investigation of democratic social and political order toward an essential aspect of democratic political engagement, namely that its constitutional form opens a space in which its own internal limitations may be renegotiated by active and passive citizens alike. A second panel, Democratic Societies and Participatory Journalism, should explore both how journalism in particular has been a resource for such renegotiation and how it may be further democratized. Finally, a public lecture by our keynote, Jan Werner Muller, will bring these more historical and more practical conversations together, working out how the media can serve as democracy's critical infrastructure. The day's events are thus meant to be experienced as a whole, so we hope that you will be able to stay for the entire day. I'd like now to introduce our moderator for the first panel. Chris Fisher is an associate professor of history at the College of New Jersey. He earned his BA from Rutgers College and his PhD in history, with a focus on U.S. diplomacy from Rutgers University in 2001. His area of expertise are the U.S. in the 20th century, Cold War culture and diplomacy, the U.S. and the world, American empire and imperialism, African American history, and racism and race relations in the U.S. It's quite a resume. With Alan Dawley and Robert C. McGreevy, he is the author of Global America, the United States in the 20th Century, Oxford 2018. And closer to home, Chris has been one of the longest serving and most devoted members of the Princeton Public Library's Humanities Council. And he has served in numerous capacities for us, so we consider him a great friend to the library and the Humanities Initiative here in particular. The core idea for this panel arose from a suggestion which he made in one of our meetings, so there's really no one better to moderate discussion. Thank you so much, Chris, and welcome back.
Wow, what a great welcome and introduction. Thank you, Cliff. Thank you all for coming out. I'm excited to be here on a Saturday morning discussing America and its principles. Most of the conversations I hear when it comes to America's principles actually don't focus on our topic today. They focus on liberty. So I'm glad we get a chance to talk about democracy, the other side of our intellectual and political tradition. Democracy as an idea, as an ideal, and as a political process holds what I would say is a curious place in U.S. history. It is as aspirational as it is fraught in our history. In fact, most of U.S. history is a contest over exactly what the concept means and who has access to it. The problem might come from, at least in my view, the fact that the U.S. was born at least twice. Once as an idealistic, or rather once through the idealistic rhetoric of the founders, then administratively in the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Both the Articles and the Constitution attempted to capture the spirit of the revolution in the form of practical government. But so much was lost in translation that the project was contested almost from the very beginning. Instead of achieving the emancipatory promise of the revolution and the intellectual hopes of a long line of thinkers and dreamers that stretch back to the ancient world, the U.S. created a hybrid system with a hierarchy of rights and privileges. An exclusive coterie of individuals, all white, all men, mainly Anglo-European and mainly propertied, had the most precious resource in the democracy: active citizenship. And with it, they had the power to shape the government and society as they saw fit. Yet, they did not live in this system by themselves. A much larger contingent made up of women, Native Americans, African Americans, immigrants, the landless, and of course children, stood on the other side of the ledger as dependents and outsiders. They lived under a different kind of citizenship, what scholars call passive citizenship. And they had to use alternate means to activate what was given to the men who were born with active citizenship, what came just by birth. Other people had to work very hard for. Today we get a chance to examine the contours of that relationship between active and passive citizenship, and think about the way that it informs our system of democracy. And there is much to discuss, and of course, very little time. So I think we should just get right to it. Right? With that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Denis Padilla Peralta, of course, a scholar from Princeton University, but also one who wears many hats. He's an associate professor at Princeton in the Classics Department, associate faculty in the African American Studies program, affiliate faculty in the program in Latin American Studies, and affiliate faculty at the University Center for Human Values. He's the author of 2 monographs, Undocumented, a Dominican boy's Odyssey, From a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League, Penguin, 2015, and Divine Institutions, Religions and Community in the Middle Roman Republic, Princeton, 2020. But he also produced 2 co-edited books and many other projects that include an upcoming book, which I was telling him about. I love the idea of this, titled A People's History of Rome. Yeah, it's a great title, right? That will be coming out with Princeton University Press. Dr. Padilla Peralta, his work examines the religions and politics of the Roman Empire, but it highlights Rome's history with slavery, and particularly in the period of its imperial expansion. As such, he also looks at comparative histories of slavery, Black feminist theory, historiography, and of course, the production of knowledge. We are delighted to have Professor Padilla Peralta speak on the link between ancient notions of democracy and citizenship and how people who are invisible to the state assert their will on those institutions. Dan out.
So I have some slides, but as I set those up, I'll begin with a few remarks intended equally as cautionary and inspirational. So One of my objectives today is to give you an origin story and to frame for you how ancient Greece and later on the Roman Republic and Empire become sites for the development of ideas of citizenship, active and passive, participatory and rights-based. But the cautionary side here comes in two forms. First, all origin stories are fraught. So even in making a claim about democracy and structures of civic governance as being rooted or as emerging in an ancient Mediterranean context, then to be taken up many, many, many centuries later in early modern and modern contexts with which many of us will be familiar, is to make an ideologically fraught claim. There are other stories you can tell about the origins of citizenship. We could, for instance, talk about the emergence of civic structures in the ancient Near East. Several scholars have argued with a formidable amount of scholarly detail over the past 25, 30 years that really, if we want to look for the origins of civic governance at a local level that enables a kind of participatory involvement and a form of democratic flourishing, we really should be looking to the city-states of the ancient Near East. But I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to talk about ancient Greece and Rome, and I'm going to prioritize a couple of features of these communities that bear directly on our conversation. I'm going to talk about how each community develops forms of active and passive citizenship. And key to that, I am going to emphasize something that has been of interest to political scientists, most notably Michael Walzer, the evolution in time of two very distinct modes of citizenship in the ancient Mediterranean, modes that have a very long life in early modern and modern contexts. We have on the one side a form of citizenship that is very much about continuous involvement in the governmental structures of one's local community. Participatory involvement at levels that can sometimes strain the contemporary imagination. Think, as I'll say more about in a moment, of the ancient Athenian case, where for enfranchised men, 1/4 of their adult lives was spent in some form of civic engagement, right? That's kind of a big deal. And on the other side, a rights-based system of citizenship that guarantees the protection of certain basic claims to life, to property, but does not come with automatic access to modes of governance and self-governance. These are the two distinctions. These are the major poles around which my remarks will cluster. Gotta be plugged in. Oh! See, I saw you. I was like, oh no. That's all right. We are good. We are in the game. So let me start by saying a few words about Athens in the 5th century. So following these significant reforms in the final decade of the 6th century BC, we have in place in Athens a system where there are several governmental bodies that are open to and run by all male citizens. But before you get too carried away in the idea that is constructed both by ancient and modern representations of Athenian democracy, i.e. that it is really a site for the exercise of demokratia, people power, I gotta emphasize something quite significant about who is gaining access to the system and who is shut out from the system. For classical Athens, we know that the population is somewhere in the vicinity of about 200,000 people. That figure includes men, women, and crucially, it includes free and unfree members of the community. Of these, about 20,000 are fully enfranchised men. It is this core of 20,000 that participates in the machinery of governance that you see laid out on this slide. There's an assembly that's open to all male citizens and a council of 500 that sets the legislative agenda. There are juries, which are people's law courts of 201 to 501 citizens, and there are boards of citizen magistrates. There are a couple of basic structural features about Athenian democracy that steer it to a model of active citizenship for those who participate in this system. There are lotteries for office. There is state pay for civic participation. There is a very strict emphasis on collegiality, working in tandem with other people in the tenure of specific offices. And there are term limits, and there is accountability for things done in office. Yeah. So, I noted this earlier. How much time is being spent in civic participation if you are an adult male citizen at Athens? About a fourth of your adult life, because you have dozens of assembly meetings to attend, you serve on the Council of 500 for a year, you have regular jury duty, you have service as a magistrate chosen by lot, and also you have military service, which is mandatory. I come back to the point about who is eligible to participate in this system. Athenian-born men only. And after 451 BCE, a law is passed stipulating that only individuals born of 2 Athenian citizens can be citizens themselves. So this introduces a biopolitical dimension to this structure. It is not automatically guaranteed to you that on being born in Athens, you will hold citizenship. You have to be the child, the legally recognized child of 2 Athenian citizens. And, as I noted earlier, in order to participate fully in the operations of the system, you also have to be a man. This leads to all kinds of secondary implications that, if we had more time to discuss today, I would gladly discuss with you. One of the texts that we are going to be looking at in a course I teach on citizenship that will be offered at Princeton this spring is a play by the Athenian playwright Euripides entitled The Ion, which tracks a family and specifically a person as he comes into awareness of his own Athenian identity, having been born to a woman who is the subject of sexual assault and then exposed only to be picked up and raised outside of Athens. And one of his anxieties is of returning to Athens and being acknowledged as a full Athenian citizen. He tells us, very revealingly, at one point in the play, that when a foreigner comes into the city, though in name a citizen, even if he should happen to have civic status, if he does not have an Athenian mother, if he does not have 2 parents who are Athenian citizens, his mouth's a slave. He has no right of speech. And I want you folks to sit with that for a moment, because what this passage brings out quite clearly is something that we see in our other sources, namely a very close bundling of civic status and full civic enfranchisement on the one hand, and access to being able to speak freely on the other. But I promised you that I would talk about another system, and I want briefly to say a few words about the complement and really divergent structure of governance that within a few centuries emerges in the central Mediterranean, and that in time takes over both ancient Athens and indeed all of the other political entities in the Mediterranean that come into conflict with it. This is the Roman Republic. This is the city-state that, over the course of the final half of the first millennium BCE, sweeps across the Mediterranean, combining features of republican governance with an imperializing structure. This structure is rooted in the awarding of citizenship to individuals in central and then in peninsular Italy. But there is a wrinkle to this system that in some ways makes it quite similar to the Athenian experiment. And this is the wrinkle. On the one hand, at Rome, there are many, many spaces where people can, at least notionally, communicate their civic will. Even though there is an oligarchy of sorts that runs the show by the 2nd century BCE, there are all these popular assemblies where citizens get to vote. But one of the interesting aspects of Rome's imperial expansion is that as the civic population grows, fewer and fewer people, as a percentage of the overall population, have an opportunity to make their will heard in Rome itself. Because see, this is one peculiarity of the Roman experiment that proves to have lasting implications. As the Roman Republic and later Empire expands out from central Italy and beyond, it doesn't actually overhaul its governmental structures so as to make it possible for these newly incorporated people to participate in the civic life and in the civic governance that would enable their will to be adequately expressed. If you want to participate in politics, you gotta come to Rome. And this introduces, eventually, a pretty corrosive constraint in both active and passive citizenship in the Roman state. And it's one reason why, eventually, this Roman Republican system becomes an imperial system where folks are deprived of active citizenship, but left only with access to some notional rights that can be exercised by declaring one's own status as a Roman citizen. Like Paul. But I'll set that aside. Thank you very much for listening to me. And I will now go back and return to my son, who has been amazingly cooperative throughout this whole exercise.
Excellent. So our next panelist is Rachel Devlin, who is an associate professor of history at Rutgers University, specializing in cultural politics of girlhood, sexuality, and race in the post-war U.S. She's the author of Relative Intimacy, Fathers, Adolescent Daughters, and Post-War American Culture in 2005, and A Girl Stands at the Door, The Generation of Young Women Who Desegregated America's Schools. Dr. Devlin tells the story of the many young women who stood up to the enraged protesters, hostile teachers, and hateful white peers while integrating America's classrooms. She recently did a talk for OAH on the intriguing idea of performing civic decency, which describes the approach young black women and girls took when integrating Southern schools after the Brown decision. But also that they sort of articulated and performed a kind of civic value that becomes a kind of model for citizenship. Today, Dr. Devlin will bring that idea of performative citizenship into our discussion of how people divorced from democracy challenge the expectations of passive citizenship and create new avenues for engagement. Dr. Devlin.
Yeah, I think Melvin is not.
Did the first tab, there.
Yeah.
Slideshow. Thank you.
And then down, this one down
Thank you.
here. Got it.
Can you lower the mic?
Absolutely, yeah. Is that better? Okay. And, all right, here's, I'm going to be talking mostly about my findings for research that I did for this book, A Girl Stands at the Door, which is it's actually a line from a case in Missouri. And that's where I took the title from the book. And what the book does, and I've come to see it in different ways, it's been out for 3 or 4 years, is about the massive number of girls and young women, the vastly disproportionate number of girls and young women who applied and filed lawsuits to enter historically white schools beginning in the late 1940s. And this started everywhere from rural Texas all the way up to Washington, D.C. Girls and young women would walk up to historically white schools, attempt to enroll, and when they were turned away, they'd go and file a lawsuit. These lawsuits usually engaged local counsel, and they came thick and fast during the post-war era. Typically, the history of Brown versus Board of Education is told as a story wherein Thurgood Marshall, in a virtuoso performance in front of the Supreme Court, argued Brown, and it's commonly referred to as the case of the 20th century. This is not how it happened. Thurgood Marshall was forced to take Brown versus Board to the Supreme Court probably a decade before he intended to. And the reason why is because so many girls and young women were attempting desegregation themselves, they had to get on the bandwagon. And so I'm going to talk about how that happened. The first really important case is in 1939. Lucille Bluford, who is virtually unknown, applied to the University of Missouri School of Journalism. Mizzou, as it was called, had the most prestigious journalism program in the US, if not in the world. She had gotten her degree at Kansas. She was from St. Louis, Missouri, but she could not go to Missouri. She had just graduated. Lloyd Gaines was the plaintiff that the NAACP wanted to use for this graduate school case, any graduate school test case. About a couple years into his case, he disappeared. There are a lot of different theories, but the most convincing is that he tired of the case and left the country. So Lucille Bluford stepped in his shoes and applied to the journalism school. She would go to the journalism school, attempt to enroll, and then be turned away. She went 11 times. By the time that she had gotten to the campus for her 11th visit, she basically knew all the professors, the registrar, the undergrads, the grads. Everyone started to warm to her. But finally, the University of Missouri shut down its journalism school rather than admit her. And this shows you the lengths to which these universities would go and their total commitment to segregation. She did everything for her case. She raised money. But more importantly, she wrote about it in the Kansas City Call, where she was ultimately became editor-in-chief. And her journalism is what brought many people to the cause of school desegregation. And two important moments happened in this case. Bluford was writing her own editorials on her own case, in addition to doing all the legwork for the case, because the NAACP lawyer, Charles Houston, was in DC and New York. When she lost her case, as her case was being fought, she argued that civic decency would force her neighbors in Missouri to admit her to the school. It was an act of social optimism. For most of these girls, it was an act of social optimism. And her writing was really important. When her case was lost, she turned her journalistic eye to every school desegregation case that was going on throughout the country. No case was too small time, too remote for her to write about. My work depends on Lucille Bluford a great deal for some of these more remote cases. The second thing that happened in her case is that a huge number of young people, college students, showed up to see her trial. And in fact, they were so rambunctious and so pro-Bluford that the judge eventually had to dismiss everyone from the courtroom. Charles Hamilton Houston, when he was finishing this case, he was being very performative for the young people in the room. This was the largest crowd he had ever had for a case. And he said, "A girl stands at the door and a generation waits behind." And by and large, that was what these young women did. They went forward so others could come after them. Keep going. Okay, so the next really important desegregation pioneer was Ada Sipule. Ada Sipule similarly has been forgotten, and in the most important works on Brown versus Board, she's been footnoted, essentially. She applied right after the end of the World War II, late 1946, and she was the first, and she was the only graduate student plaintiff to turn down the state's offer to create a separate black law school. So she applied in University of Oklahoma to the law school there, and when she was turned away, And the state offered to set up a black law school. She said, absolutely not. There were several other cases going on simultaneously. All of those plaintiffs accepted of separate black accommodations. Ada Sipule did not. When she first showed up at the University of Oklahoma, the students were hostile. Canada, who was the registrar, was actually was kind to her, but firmly said, no, you may not go here. She and her local lawyer filed her case. She had to raise all the money for her case. She was 21 when she began, and Professor Foster? Fisher, sorry, mentioned women and children and young people as the most disenfranchised group. And as I go through these women and think about what they were up to, I just want to keep in mind that they were those people. So Thurgood Marshall did not want to file her case. He had a male plaintiff in Texas, hem and sweat. He wanted to break down barriers in graduate school with a male plaintiff. There are a lot of reasons he might have thought this. Men were considered more important as lawyers. There were very few women lawyers at the time. But what Sipule did is ignore the New York office, and she went all around the state, and in fact, in other states too, raising money for her case. Now let's see what else I got here. So when she first approached the University of Oklahoma, the school newspaper just referred to her as that Negro girl. But by the end of it, all the press in Oklahoma and Oklahoma City began to talk about her by her name and began to follow her suit avidly. This is her with her mother when she's just returned from hearing Marshall argue before the Supreme Court about her case. Again, on her own dime, uninvited, and she just went. He won a kind of intermediate ruling. She comes back to Oklahoma. Her plane is on the tarmac. The press rush up to her and they say, Ada, how do you feel about this case? What are your thoughts? And she didn't say the NAACP has triumphed. And she didn't say, I won my case. She said, it's a beautiful constitution. I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to learn. Justice is for everyone in the United States. And this was a brilliant answer because she was tying her success to the success of American democracy writ large. And it was very savvy. It could appeal to her black constituents, it appealed to her white constituents. It was just so brilliant. And Sipule did this over and over again. When the press wanted to speak to Sipule and the other women who volunteered that I have researched, they came up with pitch perfect responses. This is her with the dean of the law school. Thurgood Marshall finally showed up. That's Amos Hall on the right, who was her local lawyer. Here she is. So she finally got into the law school. This is she graduated in '49. She was the only woman and the only person of color. This is an image of her when she had just passed the bar. It's one of my favorite images of her because she's so done. And it shows a tougher side to her. And what Ada Sipule embodied was what I see in all the girl DSEG firsts. She was poised, polite, diplomatic, but also steely in her determination. And she managed to mix those two qualities. So I just will point out, this is the Jennings twins. They filed a lawsuit in 1948 in rural Texas. That's their dad on the right. They had to be sent away to a boarding school because the KKK was out to kill them and also their father. This is an NAACP local that filed a lawsuit in rural Kansas that set the pathway for Brown. This is Esther Brown on the right, a communist who later led the school DSEG fight in rural Kansas. These are the other actors. I want to say something important about this before, and I should end. None of these families had what we would think of as resources. None of them had advanced degrees, none of them had a lot of money, and most of them didn't have connections prior to filing these lawsuits. So these are truly citizens who are taking upon themselves to act on their own. These are just, so these are some of the more working class deseg firsts in Albany, Georgia. And I just wanted to give you their images. Last thing I'll say before I stop. Some people ask me, a lot of people ask me, why girls, why not, where were the young men? And I'll just quickly say that these girls, the most important ingredient they had was commitment. Any political cause, the first thing you have to have is commitment. And then you have bravery, and then you have social skills, which girls were very, very good at. But it's the social optimism and the commitment they had to school desegregation that gave them the determination, but most importantly, the agency. And young people and women of color had agency, so discovering that, I think, is an important part of the puzzle. Thank you.
Thank you. I got to tell you, there's a lot to discuss there. Between the images and between the history itself, there's just so much to discuss. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Our next panelist, honestly, there's no way to adequately capture Professor Stanley Katz's work and who he is. Certainly, there's no way to capture his significance to the field of historical study, his importance to the humanities, or his influence in Princeton, at the library, and at the university. But since I have to try, let me say this. He is President Emeritus of the American Council of Learned Societies, a former president of the Organization of American Historians and the American Society for Legal History, a member of the Center for Jewish History, a founding member of the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, and oh yeah, he received the National Humanities Medal in 2011. Professor Katz's publications are too numerous to mention here, but I can tell you all U.S. historians have been influenced by his work on American legal and constitutional history and his studies of education policy. Today we get a chance to tap into that rich experience and to his deep well of knowledge as he explores the role of ordinary citizens in shaping civic engagement. Stan, please come on up.
I'll use one of Danielle's slides.
This one. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, well, good afternoon. It's always great to be back in the library, and this is a room that has a lot of positive vibes for me, so I'm delighted to be here. So I want to start simply by quoting something from Jan Muller, who's going to speak later this afternoon. I don't know exactly what he's going to say, but let me encourage all of you to read his book. It's a terrific book. I read it for the first time this week, actually. And one thing struck me as particularly relevant to what I want to talk to you about. I'm going to read you just a sentence or two. And it's this. It comes from page 182 of the book. Intermediary institutions must be accessible, accurate, autonomous, accessible, and thereby also acceptable. They aim not at finding the truth, but allowing citizens to take different positions on conflicts. Representative democracies have worked well when the function that intermediary powers like the press and parties, political parties, needed to fulfill for citizens were clearly recognized and thereby also accountable. They aim not at finding the truth, but at allowing citizens to take different positions on conflicts. So that's from Jan's book. I don't know whether he'll use that at all this afternoon. What I think is crucial in our topic today is intermediary institutions, and that's why I use that phrase. Jan is referring to political institutions, and a party, for instance, from that point of view, is an intermediate institution. It's something that mediates between the individual and political action, and there are a lot of other institutions, of course, of exactly that kind. Well, why are they so important? And that's, say this very quickly. And here I'm simply stealing from a friend and a really great scholar, Robert Putnam. Putnam has written a lot of books. The one that's best known and the one that I'm going to refer to today is called Bowling Alone. But in fact, Bowling Alone is a kind of popularization of a book that he had written several years before that called Making Democracy Work. Think about that for just a second. And that came from a study that he and a couple of Italian colleagues had made of the institution for the first time in 1970 of representative regional government, in Italy. So this was a constitutional and political experiment in Italy because they were deficient in local and regional government. So Bob and his colleagues went and several years later did surveys to find out if this had worked or how it had worked. And what they found, very crudely speaking, is that it worked in the North and it didn't work in the South. So that if there were high levels of civic engagement and participation in the North, not in the South. And I would like to talk about that at length, but I'm not going to do that. The reason turns out to be, they argued, that there was higher participation due to higher levels of what he called social capital, and that's what I want to talk about in just a moment. So that since there was high social capital in the North, because of its sort of urban and community organization over many centuries before, it produced enough social capital for democracy to work in the North, but democracy didn't work in the South, which was dominated by the church and the mafia. Very crudely. Okay, so when he came to apply this to the United States, he said the way to understand the dilemma of the United States, and the way to understand what he perceived in about 2000, which is when the book Bowling Alone came out, was that the levels of social capital in the United States had declined disastrously. And what his book was intended to do was to urge Americans to take the kinds of actions necessary to restore high levels of social capital. And if he were here today, he would say that was still the problem. He wrote a book after that, which gave his answer to the problem. In a sense, the title of that book was Better Together. And that's the message that he had for all this. So let me just take a couple of minutes to tell you what social capital is, and I'm going to quote from Bowling Alone. He says that the core idea of social capital is that social networks have value. Just as a screwdriver, physical capital, or a college education, human capital, can increase productivity, so too social contexts affect the productivity of individuals and groups. Whereas physical capital refers to physical objects and human capital refers to properties of individuals, social capital refers to connections among individuals, social networks, norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness that arise from them. In that sense, social capital is closely related to what some have called civic virtue. This circles back to Dan L's Greek example. The difference is that social capital calls attention to the fact that civic virtue is most powerful when embedded in dense networks of reciprocal social relations. That's very fancy social science language. If I had a blackboard here, I would draw you a picture of this. But basically what it's saying is that what makes democracy work and what creates higher levels of social capital is the existence of overlapping networks of social relationships in the society, but those are of two kinds. One kind is extremely dense, and this is the kind of social networking that appears, for instance, it's in reverse order to Danielle's chart here. So the polis is the largest unit, then you go through the village, the household, and then the individual family. So the family is the most immediate. And so the lower you get on that chart, the more intense the social networking is. Danielle is sitting here with his 4-year-old son, whom we welcome. His relation and his wife's relation to that child and his sister are very close, as is ours in our families. Whereas our relationships with our neighbors, our colleagues at work or at play may be close, but they're not that close. So they're less dense, they're less close. And the theory is then that what is required to really make social capital pervasive in a society is to stimulate both of these kinds of networking. Strong families, but also strong communities. And the reason is just what I quoted before. Social capital comes out of social networks and what he calls norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness. And that's what I want to really emphasize and conclude with. So what's key in a high social capital society is that we have this vast array of overlapping networks that give us intense relationships or weaker relationships to other individuals in the society. And that the existence of those networks and relationships creates in us trust in others. So we have trust in those people we are connected to weakly or strongly. And the key thing in a democracy, and I think you'll recognize this when I say it, is the kind of trust that really comes from weak ties. And the reason is, if you go out here at 11 o'clock tonight and you see a group of people walking toward you, in this community, you're probably not going to think twice about those people. If you were doing the same thing in Pittsburgh or in LA, you'd probably think twice about who those people were and whether you could trust them. So what's key in the society is for you to be able to trust people you do not know. We don't stop to think about that, and that is Putnam's theory. I think it's the most useful kind of thing. So what the theme of this program for me is really to ask the question, what do we have to do in a society in which levels of trust have deteriorated in a disastrous way, that we can create a situation in which anywhere in this country we can walk into the street with a feeling of security and optimism that the people we encounter will not do us harm. What this is a constitutionalization of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And this is the political form of the golden rule. And what Putnam's message to us is that we have to create the circumstances under which the political system, although it relies upon representation and is therefore not at all direct. Danielle is talking about direct democracy. We're talking about representative democracy. How do you make representative democracy work? We don't know these people. They might be George Santos. And that's a problem. And George Santos is a problem for just that reason. But if we can create a situation in which the kinds of trust and optimism and confidence we have at the lower two levels can exist for the higher level, then democracy will work. Thank you.
So we are now at the point where we are going to have a small panel discussion for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. I honestly think, Stan, you kind of set us up nicely for this. By raising that question about sort of the elements of a democracy. What does it take to get people involved? What does it take for the system to actually accept the involvement of those people? And that idea of social capital is a great way to think about really what both Rachel and Donnell said. So as you note, that social capital's goal is really to sort of leverage these overlapping networks of social relations. And that becomes sort of the pathway into the system, right? But it seems to me that when we think about what Rachel was talking about, right, that was exactly the problem. African Americans, particularly African American women, right, didn't have the kind of networks that allowed them to access the system, so they had to find other means. And I was hoping that maybe between that idea of social capital, right, which is a problem in American history, right, from the very beginning, right, that's kind of where we started, the system was set up so that only certain people had the right kind of ingredients for social capital. Whereas by the time we get to the 1940s, we begin to see a pushback in a really significant way from the people who are truly the most disadvantaged in that system. So I was hoping that maybe Rachel will want to speak to that, and then we'll bring Donnell into the conversation.
So, yeah, can you hear me?
Is it green?
No.
Press it one more time.
Oh, very good.
Oh, there it was.
Got it. Okay. So what is remarkable about these young women is the fact that they were, the fact, Cliff put the question to me, you know, what resources do they have, what connections, and and I hadn't thought about it before, and they really had no resources and no connections. Lucille Bluford was, had a college degree, she was a newspaper editor, she did have connections with the NAACP, but she was the only one. Ada Sipnell, when the NAACP representative came to her home, they wanted to recruit her brother, Lemuel, but he turned them down. And the second he turned them down, she raised her hand, I want to do it. One way, and then after Brown, girls made up somewhere around 85% of those who volunteered to desegregate historically white schools. And what you see in those young women, they did well in school, they were very self-possessed, and they all said to me when I interviewed them, I knew how to talk. So if you look at Gail Etienne, who desegregated MacDonald 19 in New Orleans in 1960, she said to me, you know, well, I was the girl that they would put up on the stage, you know, at church, and I would recite by memory the Gettysburg Address or passages from the Bible. So they brought with the capital they had was their ability to speak to adults, which was far advanced in all the young women who volunteered. They were supremely confident, and they brought with them their knowledge of how to talk to hostile white principals. This is something that they had a skill at doing. That skill came in part from being the object of white male hostility in their day-to-day lives. As they walked through urban spaces, as they worked in white homes, they were targets. So they learned how to be both confrontational and accommodating at the same time, because they would spend time in these white homes, usually with their mother, and then they go by themselves. So it's that deep experience in dealing with those who did have power. That was their only form of capital, was their experience as African American girls. And the vision that no one else had, that black and white students could get along in a formerly white space. Everyone thought in the late 1940s this could never happen. And so what they brought was their experiences, their sense of injustice, that the schools were a civic emergency, and they brought those beliefs. But in terms of networks and capital,
These were the least networked and the least and the most disenfranchised. So one last thing, the NAACP, I said Thurgood Marshall had to be convinced. What they did was they forced him into a corner. As these girls filed these lawsuits, local lawyers increasingly said, I'm going to take this case to the Supreme Court. If a non-NAACP lawyer took this case to the Supreme Court, there were only two bad outcomes. He could win the case, at which point the NAACP would lose its status as a premier civil rights organization, or he could lose the case, setting everybody back. So you just see these girls pushing these lawyers and affecting the top brass in New York, but really not having much to work with except for their determination.
Yeah. And I'm hoping that we could come back to this, the way that they access this capital by talking a little bit about that idea of civic decency.
Yeah.
And I actually want to sort of move over to Donnell and sort of highlight that that's one of the distinctions I see between the history you've given about Athens and Rome and what's playing out in the United States. These women know how to perform a kind of citizenship that I don't know if it gives them real access, but it can at least mimic it. In the story that you tell, right, particularly in Athens, the only way to access that is biological, right? I mean, you have to be born into it, which is, of course, a part of the US system, right? You have to have the right biology to be able to access the system. So I was hoping that maybe you could talk about whether it was so absolute in Athens and Rome that you had to have biology, or that there were these ways to intervene through performance.
Well, that's a fantastic setup. So, having given an account of the system as it is described in our sources and as it's idealized in 5th and 4th century BC Athenian texts, I should now stress that there is a fair amount of porousness in the system that has to do in no small part with the creativity and ingenuity of folks who, while not granted access to the participatory mechanisms of civic government, nonetheless exert pressure, meaningful pressure, constructive pressure, transformative pressure on the Athenian civic community. So one of the real enterprising findings of scholarship in the past few decades has been the focus on women in Athenian culture and politics who exert a great deal of pressure, either through litigation, this is particularly the case in the 4th century BC, making use of the capital that they have accrued, both social and monetary, to engage in forms of legal self-defense. And also at the same time, and this is something that bridges between the Athenian example and the Roman one, relying on some of the ingrained social expectations that attach to the responsibilities and prerogatives of Athenian civic women in particular, to exert forms of pressure outside of the political institutional structures that I showed you on that chart. So what Josie Bloch, a scholar of Athenian citizenship, has shown is that women are incredibly powerful players in the religious realm. Actually, like if we think about collective action in Athenian spaces, and for that matter in other ancient Mediterranean societies, especially ones that are organized along city-state lines, where we see women not just prominent, but actually to some degree dictating the terms of social engagement, is in religious and ritual settings. Oh, thank you so much. Maybe open this for you? Oh, you locked me out of my phone. That's very unfortunate. You got to hold it. Sit over there. You want to draw? Okay, it'll get better in a moment once you can unlock it. Oh, there we go. Yay! Go, 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 go. So one example that I've been using, maybe my phone will never allow me access again. One example that I like using in the Roman case is of an episode that occurs in 331 BCE. And it's an instructive example because it shows us both the capacity and limits of attending to what is described as the form of Roman citizenship. So I'll set the scene very briefly. In 331 BCE, Rome is in the early stages of a multi-decade expansion across the Italian peninsula. And already by 331 BC, Rome has developed a tiered form of citizenship that divides communities that are subject to it into three categories. There are allies, and these allies have as their responsibility contributing manpower to Rome's armies. Then there are two different classes of citizenship. One is referred to as the civitas optimo iure, or citizenship with full or the best right. And the other one is referred to as the civitas, as the civitas sine suffragio, or the citizenship without the vote. And this is a deliberately disenfranchising form of citizenship. And according to our sources, the citizenship that comes without the vote, you can go sit down in the front row, is imposed on communities that, for various reasons, resist or defy Rome's stated expansionist objectives in this period. So in 331 BC, we have a series of poisonings that occur in the city of Rome. They target individuals in the highest rungs of Roman society, and they are orchestrated by people whose identities prove elusive. There's this panic in the city. Who is responsible for these poisons? And at a key moment in the desperate effort on the part of Roman magistrates to ascertain what is going on, an enslaved woman comes to a Roman magistrate and says, I know who is responsible for this. I will bring you to the people who are responsible for this. And it turns out that this enslaved woman, this Anquila, is going to bring several Roman magistrates to the households of elite aristocratic women at Rome who are behind the poisonings, right? They have been systematically taking out some of their spouses and other members of Rome's aristocracy. So there are a couple of different ways of reading this episode, right? As my son continues scheming behind me. So one way is to, yeah, what's up? You want to play the piano? I don't think so. I think we have to sit those in the seat. Can you get your comic book though? Yeah. No. So one way of reading the episode is to insist on the fact that Roman elite women by this point are trying to assert control over politics via non-institutional means, right? Another way of reading the episode, and one that occupied a fair amount of my energy earlier this year, is to take a closer look at the capacity of this enslaved woman to access a Roman magistrate. And to say, and to say, are you sure? I don't think so. And to say, okay, what's at stake here is the ability, even of a notionally unfree person at Rome, to access the operations of government, to make a report to an elected magistrate that then triggers an investigation that culminates in the administration of justice, right? And if this reconstruction of things is right, and I think there's some merit to reading things in this way, this gives us really powerful insight into the ability even of socially marginalized individuals in the city of Rome, individuals who do not have citizenship of any kind, who are structurally immiserated within the system, to access basic resources that can then be put effectively to use in the administration of justice. We don't know what happens to this enslaved woman afterwards. We know of other enslaved women later on in Roman history who, after making reports of similar activities, received their freedom. But the important point is simply to think about how this structure, for all of its rigidity and its emphasis on curtailing or circumscribing the access to political involvement to a very bounded class of actors, nonetheless allows a measure of agency and initiative on the part of the marginalized to manifest itself. And that's a pretty potent thing in this context.
Stan, I see you over there jotting down some notes. I'm wondering if you want to respond to these.
I want to say just two things, really. The first is just to say something I meant to say but didn't say before. Because I started by talking about intermediate structures or institutions. And of course, we're in one of those. The public library is one of the key intermediate structures in the democracy of Princeton, New Jersey. But there are others, and we were just talking about the role of religion. Most of the people in this room belong to a church or a temple or a mosque. Many of us belong to social organizations of one sort or another. And it is those institutions that constitute the infrastructure that I was talking about. What struck me in what the two of you said, and Rachel and I have to have a conversation later. I don't agree with the interpretation she has. But I think where the two come together here is actually in their reference to law. In both in our society and in ancient Greece and Rome, the role of law was enormously important. And Danielle is sort of taking it for granted here, although he could explain it to you, why it was that legal structures were available as mechanisms for dispute resolution and other kinds of things. And certainly that's what Rachel is talking about here. There's a reason why these girls went to court. And by the way, we didn't talk about it, but they went to federal court. They didn't go to state courts. We live in a complicated polity here. So each of those girls lived in a state, Oklahoma or some other state. But the court that could give them a remedy was not the courts of Oklahoma. And there were good reasons for that in the 1940s. It was the federal courts, because it was the expansion of constitutional rights at the federal, not at the state level, that made remedy possible. In the end, Brown versus the Board of Education is so important, and I think it is so important, because the decision in 1954, 54, 55 was binding on all of the courts, whether they were state courts or federal courts. And it made it possible, for instance, in later cases in that series, like the situation in Little Rock in 1957 and 1960, for the courts to intervene. That creates problems later, to be sure, but provides remedies. But there are a whole series of institutions that make that possible. And Rachel has emphasized the individual participation in all this. I think that's enormously important. But I would argue she doesn't give enough credit, at least in what she talked to us about, to the NAACP and to other institutions. There was, after all, a long-term strategy going back to the late 1920s to litigate what becomes finally Brown versus the Board of Education. And I don't think it's only an individual initiative that accounts for it. But in any case, that's the point I want to make, is that in the long term, what's going to matter is the way in which individual autonomy and individual decisions become embedded in an institutional infrastructure that gives them both plausibility and credibility and effectual, can't even think of the right word for it, effectiveness as political mechanisms.
What I like about what you just said, Stan, is I think you cut to the heart of the sort of obstacles, right, to accessing democracy for groups that are forced onto the margin. But I want to give Rachel a chance to respond if you'd like, and then I want to come back to that, because I want to tie what you just said to that question at the center of all of it, and that is trust. But I'll let Rachel respond.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So you're not the first person to say simply, I don't believe it. These girls couldn't have done all that. They weren't powerful. And Richard Klugar, who wrote the magisterial work on Brown versus Board, which is considered the work, it came out in the late 1970s. And so he was a man of his time, and he didn't look at these women and girls.
A Princeton graduate.
Yeah. And I tried to get this published, as an article with several different premier journals, and they all turned me down. And so I had gotten to a point of practical despair until Basic Books picked up the book. But a quote that I was not allowed, I didn't have time, did not allow me to pull up, was Thurgood Marshall admitting in 1968 that they had no intention of pursuing grade school desegregation as early as 1950. And he actually says, and I was so thrilled when I found this old cassette tape of an interview, he said, "We didn't want any of these cases. We didn't want them, but we had them. We were going to take it down slowly, graduate school, then college, then high school, and we wanted to take our time. But here we go." And he admits, he said there was no plan. Everyone thought we had a plan, there was no plan. And so from the horse's mouth, how it happened, and I was so thrilled when I found this quote because people didn't believe me about these girls and they had so much agency. But truly they were forced into a corner. And to me that shows this kind of pressure through the courts, starting with local lawyers, all of whom intended to appeal it to the Supreme Court. So that the Supreme Court ruled as it did was revolutionary. That they considered the case at all was also revolutionary in a way that we don't typically understand legal revolutions to happen. I want to address something else you guys said, but I'll do it later.
Okay. Well, I want to turn it over to the floor for the next 20 minutes, but before we do, I want to sort of return to Stan's point, because I think it really does pull everything together. And you put it very simply, right? Democracy is a system based upon human reason, right? And the assumption is that people who are reasonable, or who have the ability to reason, right, can make good choices and produce good government, right? That's sort of the way we imagine it. And those choices come down to whether you trust the people to be able to do that, right? And that's always been sort of the benchmark on why some groups can come in and some groups can have access to it and some groups cannot. We can't trust that these people will make rational decisions that can then, preserve the republic or the institution. But it raises the question, which I think the other speakers talked to, how do you manufacture trust, right? And I think you put it perfectly. You see it in different places, right? You see it in political organizations. You see it in social institutions, the church, right? And I think you put it sort of took it to another level when you said women have been expert at accessing those institutions that allow them to gain access to the system because those institutions already have trust, right? So I just wanted to sort of pull that together, right? There are ways that people at local levels are able to manufacture what some people are born with, simply by using the institutions at their disposal, like the Princeton Public Library. Right? All right, so I want to open it up to the floor. We can come back to some of these points here, and we'll go from there.
We do have mics for questions, so I'll bring a mic around. So just wait until I get to you before you deliver your question. So I think I saw you first, sir.
And I'm going to let Cliff handle hands, because I can't see.
This question is for Professor Katz. You mentioned about social capital. This is a term used very popularly these days. I go back 35 years ago. I have taken my daughter to one of the key Ivy League schools, and we are in the dining room eating lunch. And the lunch, there's a table, there are 11 black students. There's a table, there are 6 or 7 Asian students. Then there are many tables, there are mostly whites, almost all whites. And even within the whites, there are girls and the boys separately. Now, I want to ask you that, are these people building social capital? My daughter, after the lunch, she walked out, she said, "Dad, I don't want to go to this school because this is nothing but discrimination." So my question to you is, were these people building social capital as you define the social capital?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question, and that's a very common kind of problem. I was used to be called master. I was the head of a residential college here, and certainly that was a problem in our dining room. Students tend to cluster in their own groupings. It goes back to what I said before. That's because those tables represent strong bond forms of social capital. And what your daughter was saying was, I want to go to a place where social capital takes the weak form, and so that you could sit at any table and you'd be likely to sit at any table without seeking out those with whom you have previous either identification or relationships. So this is going to be a problem in any democracy, and it's not too surprising. It's very difficult. We struggle at a place like Princeton, but at other institutions, to figure out what to do about that. It's a very real kind of problem. But the answer, it's like asking, what is the answer to bad speech? And the answer is more speech. And then what is the answer to the lack of civic and social engagement? The answer is more engagement. But how to do that is the problem. What do we have to do in order to encourage people to relate more actively and intimately to one another? And that's, Putnam says, we're better together. Well, that's correct, but it doesn't happen naturally, and it doesn't happen easily. It requires social engineering. That's really what Rachel was talking about, the young women being proactive to find places for themselves in arenas they felt they needed and wanted to be. But we have to find ways of making that happen. And finally, let me just say that I don't entirely agree with what Chris said. In some sense, it doesn't make any difference whether we trust other voters. This goes back to Danelle's example. After all, Hillary Clinton notoriously talked about the deplorables. Well, if you try to get back to what she probably meant by that, she was trying to say, there are people who don't share my values. And I certainly can't have full trust in them, and that's true for all of us, whatever our values are. There are others in the society who don't share those values. But in the same way that Greek democracy got along with institutions that systematically excluded and discriminated against certain members of the larger community, we do too. We have to live with that, but we have to find ways for us to deal with that in civil, go back to Chris, civil forms of behavior.
Next question.
Thanks. This is a question actually for Danelle, but I'd like Stan's both other opinions as well. When you gave the example of the slave who went to report that she knew who was doing the poisoning, the women who were doing the poisoning, though, had less access or didn't feel they had access, or maybe they felt their access was by poisoning the other men. And that was that they had a lack of trust in the people they were poisoning, and somehow the slave felt this is my opinion, of course, but that she had access and maybe would have some power by turning in these other women. So I question the way of access there.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I love that question. That seems to be a perfectly valid interpretation of the episode. So let me take a step back in the spirit of Stan's comment earlier about rule of law, and think more expansively about one of the issues that is sort of simmering in our conversation, but that we could do well to sort of bring out fully. One of the features of a democratic or republican structure in ancient Mediterranean context, or early modern or modern context, that would be maximally conducive to the generation of social capital and trust is a presumption of immunity from physical harm. So if one looks at the Athenian and Roman cases in this respect, and now I am moving away from the example in 331 BC I gave to sort of think more expansively about what this immunity entails or how this immunity is unequally distributed. We see straight away that there are some sort of intriguing features of Athenian and Roman civic discourse that ultimately revolve around who has a presumption of immunity from harm, from physical harm, from actually being hit or struck, and who does not have that presumption, right? So in these different, but in some ways complementary ancient political systems, the operating principle in both ancient Greece and in Rome is that citizen men have basic rights against having their bodies harmed unless they are convicted of a crime. This does not hold true for other categories of the population, right? So on this reading, the enslaved woman of 331 BC makes a gamble, because what I have not disclosed so far is that one of the peculiarities of the rule of law characteristic of both ancient Greece and Rome is that enslaved persons were routinely tortured in order to deliver legally actionable evidence. So their testimony was not taken, as truthful whenever they reported anything to a magistrate. They were subject to torture in order to corroborate, in order to substantiate their claims as legally actionable, right? So this enslaved woman really takes the risk of being tortured, and it's not inconceivable that she was tortured in the course of eliciting further information about the poisonings themselves. But for me, this does, I think, offer a different and more clarifying space within which to repose some of the questions that have been of interest to us in our conversation. And I'll try to lay out at least two sort of axes for further discussion. First of all, in the Athenian context, there's a lot of discussion about whether in a direct democratic participatory environment of the kind that Athens is, you can automatically assume that someone you see on the street is someone who should be immune from physical punishment, right? So if you bump into someone, you don't know them in classical Athens, can you just shove them? Can you just say, hey, you bumped into me. Can I hit you if I feel inconvenienced by you? And the answer that one Athenian thinker gives to this in the final decades of the 5th century BC, a person who in the scholarship is known as the old oligarch, is that you can't do this. You can't do this, even though the old oligarch says, I would really want to, especially, I would really want to hit, especially like an unfree person who walks by me, but I can't do this, because I have to assume, my default has to be, that anyone I interact with in this space also has citizenship and therefore has a basic immunity from being struck, right? In the Roman case, this also seems to have been an operative principle, although here there's a wrinkle. So one of the stories I love to teach with is this episode in the 2nd century BC involving a person named Lucius Rutius. So in the 2nd century BC, the top sliver of the Roman elite become fabulously wealthy as a consequence of Rome's imperializing expansion. I mean, like ludicrously wealthy, like wealthier than any Romans had been up to that point in history by several orders of magnitude. And this Lucius is aware of these fines that are introduced and imposed some centuries prior for striking other members of the community unreasonably. If you strike someone, you gotta pay a fine, right? But this fine was never re-tariffed in the era leading up to the spectacular infusion of wealth into the Roman community. So it's really cheap for him to go around and just smack people and then have one of his attendants pay them out money for doing this, right? This eventually is the site of a legal action, right? Because people take serious exception to being struck at random by these like wandering aristocrats who think it's really fun to hit other people, right? And so in some contexts, this is understood as marking another watershed in the evolving conception of the Roman state as a system of power that also protects the immunity of all citizen members from physical harm, right? You can no longer, just because you have money, simply get away with doing this by paying a fine. You are actually going to be disciplined in new and ever more stringent ways against doing this kind of stuff. But what it shows us is that in these two different contexts, there's a great deal of anxiety about the relationship between civic status and immunity from physical harm, and that this also gets rounded along gendered lines in the context of the 331 episode and afterwards. After all, at the end of the day, the women who were eventually found out to be the poisoners were subjected to the death penalty. They faced the capital punishment. And if one reads against the grain of this source material, one can't help but think that some of this was actually really unfair. That, as you pointed out in your invitation to rethink this episode, they were reacting against a situation where they felt that they had no agency except to undertake this action, right? But this is the kind of discourse about physical harm, inviolability, and immunity that is active in both of these settings, that is coloring that episode and other episodes like it.
Well, all right. Next question.
Hi, excuse me. Regarding the issue of public trust, I think we could bring that to the present day with the situation with COVID. I feel like, first of all, Pfizer had previously paid a record fine of $2.3 billion for healthcare fraud. Then they were given immunity for their products. Then thousands of people were fired for not taking their products, which did not prevent transmission. The EU brought people up from Pfizer to ask them that question. I don't see that happening in this country. I feel like, would somebody in this room who is sane hire a contractor for their house who had previously paid the highest fine in history of that area, and then when the contractor arrived, said, sign this paper so I have no liability for whatever happens to your house afterwards, and say, oh yeah, that's a good idea, I'll do that, forgive and forget, and so forth. But that's what we're facing as a society. There are thousands of reports of injuries, which are all being censored. Facebook has taken down groups regularly. And I feel like now the military is hiring people back quietly that they fired with like some type of dishonorable discharge, and people are trying to paper everything over. But I do feel like unless, there's not going to be any trust left at all if we don't address some of the things that went down in the last few years.
Does anyone want to speak to that? It almost speaks to something you said earlier, Stan.
I think it's important. I don't want to address the particular issue, but I mean, trust in the system is at a very low point now. I'm not going to quote polls, but almost all institutions in our society now are registering on opinion polling historically low levels. We as a society are losing trust in the law, in political institutions, in religious institutions. Almost all, in the military, to name another one that you mentioned. And that is, I think, the larger problem. And there are these individualized specific problems, to be sure. But the question we face is there a way that we can restore levels of trust across the society so that institutions that were previously not only acceptable but trustworthy institutions for us look that way again? And the most immediate problem now is, I mentioned George Santos, but look at Donald Trump. If a candidate for the presidency can campaign on a platform of mistrust of law, which is essentially what's happening now, I think we're in deep trouble. And this is not about Mr. Trump. This is about the fact that ploy is an acceptable ploy at the moment. I think the most urgent problem we have is to get back to a situation where whatever our differences, because after all, and Danielle's been talking about this, Conflict is inherent to democracy. Nothing wrong with that. It's as American as apple pie, and it's acceptable. But if we can't deal with it in a civilized way, and if we can't process it in a way that we can come up with solutions that are acceptable across the society, then we're in deep trouble, and I think we're in deep trouble.
Okay, so I know there are a lot of questions still, but we're actually a few minutes past time. So there's a lunch waiting out beyond those doors. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their patience and their excellent responses and their engagement with this topic. So let's all give them a round of applause and then